It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these, the last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was distinguished. In an incoherent, and, as I deeply feel, an entirely inadequate fashion, I have endeavoured to give some account of my strange experiences in his company. But it was my intention to have said nothing of that event which has created a void in my life which the lapse of 2 years has done little to fill. My hand has been forced, however, by the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother, and I have no choice but to lay these facts before the public exactly as they occurred. It lies with me to tell for the first time what really took place between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It may be remembered that after my marriage and my subsequent start in private practice, the very intimate relations which had existed between Holmes and myself became, to some extent, modified. He still came to me from time to time when he desired a companion in his investigations, but these occasions grew more and more seldom. It was with some surprise, therefore, that I saw him walk into my consulting room upon the evening of April the 24th. It struck me that he was looking even paler and thinner than usual. "Yes, I've been using myself up rather too freely," he remarked, in answer to my look rather than my words. "I have been a little pressed of late." Holmes edged his way round the wall, and flinging the shutters together, he bolted them securely. "You're afraid of something?" I asked. "Well, I am." "Of what?" "Of air guns." "My dear Holmes, what do you mean?" "I think that you know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I am by no means a nervous man. At the same time, it is stupidity rather than courage to refuse to recognize danger when it is close upon you." "I must apologize for calling so late," said he, "and I must further beg you to be so unconventional as to allow me to leave your house presently by scrambling over your back garden wall." "But what does it all mean?" I asked. He held out his hand, and I saw in the light of the lamp the two of his knuckles were burst and bleeding. "It's not an airy nothing, you see," said he, smiling. "On the contrary, it is solid enough for a man to break his hand over. Is Mrs. Watson in?" "She's away upon a visit." "Indeed. You're alone?" "Quite." "Then it makes it easier for me to propose that you come away with me for a week to the continent." "Where?" "Oh, anywhere. It's all the same to me." There was something very strange in all this. It was not Holmes' nature to take an aimless holiday, and something about his pale, worn face told me that his nerves were at their highest tension. He saw the question in my eyes, and putting his fingertips together and his elbows upon his knees, he explained the situation. "You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty," said he. "Never. Aye, there's the genius and the wonder of the thing," he cried. "The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. I tell you, Watson, in all seriousness, that if I could beat that man, if I could free society of him, I should feel that my own career had reached its summit, and I should be prepared to turn to some more placid line of life. But I could not rest, Watson. I could not sit quiet in my chair if I thought that such a man as Professor Moriarty were walking the streets of London unchallenged." "What has he done, then?" "His career has been an extraordinary one. He's a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21, he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which has had a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair of one of our smaller universities, and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the higher criminal world of London so well as I do. For years past, I have continually been conscious of some power behind the malefactor, some deep organizing power which forever stands in the way of the law and throws its shield over the wrongdoer. For years I have endeavored to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He sits motionless like a spider in the center of its web. But that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of each of them. He does little himself. He only plans. Is there a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, a house to be rifled, a man to be removed? The word is passed to the professor, the matter is organized and carried out. The agent may be caught, but the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This was the organization which I deduced, Watson, but do what I would, it seemed impossible to get evidence which would convict in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson, and yet at the end of 3 months I was forced to confess that I had at last met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. But at last he made a trip. Only a little trip, but it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon him. I had my chance, and starting from that point, I have woven my net round him until now it is all ready to close. In 3 days, that is to say, on Monday next, matters will be ripe, and the professor, with all the principal members of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Now, if I could have done this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well. But he was too wily for that. He saw every step which I took to draw my toils round him. Again and again he strove to break away, but I as often headed him off. Never have I risen to such a height, and never have I been so hard pressed by an opponent. This morning the last steps were taken, and 3 days only were wanted to complete the business. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me. My nerves are fairly proof, Watson, but I must confess to a start when I saw the very man who had been so much in my thoughts standing there on my threshold. His appearance was quite familiar to me. He is extremely tall and thin. His forehead domes out in a white curve, and his 2 eyes are deeply sunken in his head. His shoulders are rounded from much study, and his face protrudes forward and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion. He peered at me with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. "You have less frontal development than I would have expected," said he at last. "It's a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of one's dressing gown." The fact is that upon his entrance I had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger in which I lay. The only conceivable escape for him lay in silencing my tongue. At his remark, I drew the weapon out and laid it cocked upon the table. He smiled and blinked, but there was something about his eyes which made me feel very glad that I had it there. "You evidently don't know me," said he. "On the contrary," I answered, "I think it is fairly evident that I do. Pray take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes, if you have anything to say." "All that I have to say has already crossed your mind," said he. "Then possibly my answer has crossed yours," I replied. "You stand fast?" "Absolutely." He clapped his hand into his pocket, and I erased the pistol from the table, but he merely drew out a memorandum book in which he had scribbled some dates. "You crossed my path on the 4th of January, said he. "On the 23rd you incommoded me. In the middle of February I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now at the close of April the situation is becoming an impossible one." "Have you any suggestion to make?" I asked. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," said he, swaying his face about. "You really must, you know." "After Monday," said I. "Tut, tut," said he. "I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see there can be but one outcome. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say unaffectedly that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take extreme measures." "Danger is a part of my trade," I remarked. "This is not danger," said he. "It is inevitable destruction. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you." "You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," said I. "Let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interests of the public, cheerfully accept the latter." "I can promise you the one, but not the other." He turned his rounded back upon me and went peering and blinking out of the room. I went out about midday to transact some business. As I passed the corner which leads onto Welbeck Street crossing, a 2-horse van whizzed round and was on me like a flash. I sprang and saved myself by the fraction of a second. I kept to the pavement after that, Watson, but as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from the roof of one of the houses and was shattered to fragments at my feet. Now I have come round to you, and on my way I was attacked by a rough with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody. But I can tell you with most absolute confidence that no possible connection will ever be traced between him and the retiring mathematical coach, who is, I dare say, working out problems upon a blackboard 10 miles away. I'd often admired my friend's courage, but never more than now, as he sat checking off a series of incidents which must have combined to make up a day of horror. "You will spend the night here," I said. "No, my friend. You might find me a dangerous guest. I have my plans laid, and all will be well. Therefore I cannot do better than to get away for the few days which remain before the police are at liberty to act. It would be a great pleasure to me if you would come on the continent with me." "Oh, my practice is quiet," said I, "and I have an accommodating neighbour. I shall be glad to come. Where shall I meet you?" "At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us." "The carriage is our rendezvous, then?" "Yes." With a few more hurried words as to our plans for the morrow, he rose and came out with me into the garden, clambering over the wall which leads into Mortimer Street and immediately whistling for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning I obeyed Holmes' injunctions to the letter, and I had no difficulty in finding the carriage which he had indicated, the less so as it was the only one in the train which was marked engaged. My only source of anxiety now was the non-appearance of Holmes. The station clock marked only 7 minutes from the time when we were due to start. In vain I searched among the groups of travellers and leave-takers for the lithe figure of my friend. There was no sign of him. I spent a few minutes in assisting a venerable Italian priest who was endeavouring to make a porter understand in his broken English that his luggage was to be booked through to Paris. Then, having taken another look around, I returned to my carriage, where I found that the porter, in spite of the ticket, had given me my decrepit Italian friend as a travelling companion. It was useless for me to explain to him that his presence was an intrusion, for my Italian was even more limited than his English. So I shrugged my shoulders resignedly and continued to look out anxiously for my friend. A chill of fear had come over me, as I thought that his absence might mean that some blow had fallen during the night. Already the doors had all been shut, and the whistle blown when... "My dear Watson," said a voice, "you have not even condescended to say good morning." I turned in uncontrollable astonishment. The aged ecclesiastic had turned his face towards me. For an instant the wrinkles were smoothed away, the nose drew away from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, and the mouth to mumble. The dull eyes regained their fire, the drooping figure expanded. The next, the whole frame collapsed again, and Holmes was gone as quickly as he had come. "Good heavens," I cried, "how you startled me." "Every precaution is still necessary," he whispered. "I have every reason to think that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, that is Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as Holmes spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing his way furiously through the crowd. It was too late, however, for we were rapidly gathering momentum, and an instant later had shot clear of the station. "With all our precautions, you see that we have cut it rather fine," said Holmes, laughing. He rose, and throwing off the black cassock and hat which had formed his disguise, he packed them away in a handbag. "But we must plan what we are to do about Moriarty now." "As this is an express," I said, "and as the boat runs in connection with it, I should think that we have shaken him off very effectively." "My dear Watson, you evidently did not realize my meaning when I said that this man may be taken as being quite on the same intellectual plane as myself. What will he do?" "What I should do." What would you do, then?" "Engage a special." "But it must be late." "By no means. This train stops at Canterbury, and there is always at least a quarter of an hour's delay at the boat. He will catch us there." "One would think that we were the criminals." "Let's have him arrested on his arrival." "It would be to ruin the work of 3 months. We should get the big fish, but the smaller would dart right and left out of the net. On Monday we should have them all. No, an arrest is inadmissible." "What then?" "We shall get out of Canterbury." "Why, and then?" "Well, then we must make a cross-country journey to Newhaven, and so over to Dieppe." At Canterbury, therefore, we alighted, and I was still looking rather ruefully after the rapidly disappearing luggage van which contained my wardrobe, when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed up the line. "Already, you see," said he. Far away from among the Kentish woods there rose a thin spray of smoke. A minute later a carriage and engine could be seen flying along the open curve which leads to the station. We had hardly time to take our places behind a pile of luggage when it passed with a rattle and a roar, beating a blast of hot air into our faces. "There he goes," said Holmes. "There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a coup de maître had he deduced what I would deduce and acted accordingly." We made our way to Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on upon the third day as far as Strasbourg. On the Monday morning, Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening we found a reply waiting for us at our hotel. Holmes tore it open and then, with a bitter curse, hurled it to the ground. "I might have known it," he groaned. "He has escaped. Moriarty, they have secured the whole gang with the exception of him. He has given them the slip. Of course, when I had left the country there was no one to cope with him. But I did think that I put the game in their hands. I think that you had better return to England, Watson." "Why?" "Because you will find me a dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is gone. He is lost if he returns to London. If I read his character right, he will devote his whole energies to revenging himself upon me. I should certainly recommend you to return to your practice." We sat in the Strasbourg salle à manger, arguing the question for half an hour, but the same night we had resumed our journey and were well on our way to Geneva. For a charming week we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, branching off at Luc, we made our way over the Gemmi Pass, still deep in snow. It was a lovely trip. The dainty green of the spring below, the virgin white of the winter above. But it was clear to me that never for one instant did Holmes forget the shadow which lay across him. In the homely alpine villages or in the lonely mountain passes, I could still tell by his quick glancing eyes and his sharp scrutiny of every face that passed us that he was well convinced that, walk where we would, we could not walk ourselves clear of the danger which was dogging our footsteps. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never depressed. On the contrary, I can never recollect having seen him in such exuberant spirits. Again and again he referred to the fact that if he could be assured that society was freed from Professor Moriarty, he would cheerfully bring his own career to a conclusion. It was on the 3rd day of May that we reached the little village of Maringen, where we put up at the Englischerhof, then kept by Peter Stuyler the elder. At his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night at the hamlet of Rosenley. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which are about halfway up the hills, without making a small detour to see them. It was indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm lined by glistening coal-black rock and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable depth. We stood near the edge, peering down and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss. The path had been cut halfway round the fall to afford a complete view, but it ends abruptly and the traveller has to return as he came. We had turned to do so when we saw a Swiss lad come running along it with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel which we had just left and was addressed to me by the landlord. It appeared that within a very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived who was in the last stages of consumption. A sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her. It was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and if I would only return, etc., etc., etc. The good Stuyler assured me in a postscript that he would himself look upon my compliance as a very great favour. The appeal was one which could not be ignored. Yet I had my scruples about leaving Holmes. It was finally agreed, however, that he should retain the young Swiss messenger with him as guide and companion while I returned to Maringen. As I turned away, I saw Holmes with his back against a rock and his arms folded, gazing down at the rush of the waters. It was the last that I was ever destined to see of him in this world. When I was near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. It was impossible from that position to see the fall, but I could see the curving path which winds over the shoulder of the hills and leads to it. Along this a man was, I remember, walking very rapidly. I noted him and the energy with which he walked, but he passed from my mind again as I hurried on upon my errand. It may have been a little over an hour before I reached Maringen. Old Stuyler was standing at the porch of his hotel. "Well," said I, as I came hurrying up, "I trust that she's no worse." A look of surprise passed over his face, and at the first quiver of his eyebrows my heart turned to lead in my breast. "You did not write this," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman in the hotel?" "Certainly not," he cried. "But it has the hotel mark upon it." "Ah, it must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in after you had gone. He said—" But I waited for none of the landlord's explanation. In a tingle of fear, I was already running down the village street. It had taken me an hour to come down. For all my efforts, 2 more had passed before I found myself at the Fall of Reichenbach once more. There was Holmes' alpine stock still leaning against the rock by which I had left him. But there was no sign of him, and it was in vain that I shouted. My only answer was my own voice reverberating in a rolling echo from the cliffs around me. It was the sight of that alpine stock which turned me cold and sick. He had not gone to Rosenley then. He had remained on that 3-foot path with sheer wall on one side and sheer drop on the other, until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss had gone too. Who was to tell what had happened then? I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing. Then I began to think of Holmes' own methods and to try to practice them in reading this tragedy. It was, alas, only too easy to do. The blackish soil is kept forever soft by the incessant drift of spray, and a bird would leave its tread upon it. 2 lines of footmarks were clearly marked along the farther end of the path, both leading away from me. There were none returning. A few yards from the end, the soil was all ploughed up into a patch of mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed the chasm were torn and bedraggled. I lay upon my face and peered down into the spray spouting up all around me. It had darkened since I left, and now I could only see here and there the glistening of moisture upon the black walls, and far away down at the end of the shaft the gleam of the broken water. I shouted, but only that same half-human cry of the fall was borne back to my ears. But it was destined that I should, after all, have a last word of greeting from my friend and comrade. From the top of a boulder, the gleam of something bright caught my eye, and, raising my hand, I found that it came from the silver cigarette case which he used to carry. As I took it up, a small square of paper upon which it had lain fluttered down to the ground. Unfolding it, I found that it consisted of 3 pages torn from his notebook and addressed to me. "My dear Watson," it said, "I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of those questions which lie before us. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letter from Maringa was a hoax. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, yours very sincerely, Sherlock Holmes." A few words may suffice to tell the little that remains. An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the 2 men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, in their reeling over locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation, whom I shall ever regard as the best and wisest man whom I have ever known.